if you feel like your reviewer isn't getting it done, you can ask for adult supervision earlier rather than later to help shepherd the process, and we often do that. You've got to do it respectfully and whatnot, but you know when you're going a little bit askance. You're going not on the track any longer.
Hello, welcome to episode 26 of FDA Watch. I'm your host, Wayne Pines. As you know, we're the only independent, nonpartisan national forum dedicated to discussing FDA. I want to remind you, if you have not already subscribed to the podcast, you can do so today at fdawatch.net. That's fdawatch.net. You will receive an email when a new episode is released, including some bonus episodes and breaking news episodes. And we have signature series that are always going on, such as our ongoing series right now with Scadden. So you'll get quick access to our headlines and resource links as well. So please do subscribe, fdawatch.net. Today we're going to focus on medical devices. We have three guests, but let me first go to the headlines. From the Pharma desk, FDA reported progress after the first year of its roadmap to reduce animal testing. Animal testing has been a big issue for some time in drug development. FDA is now relying more on computer models, laboratory-based human systems. The effort, of course, is to phase out, to the extent possible, certain animal studies. The agency also released a follow-up report outlining progress to date and next steps for continuing the transition toward non-animal testing approaches. From the devices desk, CDRH issued a letter to provide manufacturers of CDRH-led combination products with information pertaining to potential nitrosamine impurities. When I was at FDA, we dealt with nitrosamine many years ago. It seems as though it's a recurring issue. The letter described manufacturer responsibilities and highlights resources that may assist in identifying and managing potential nitrosamine impurities in device products. This letter is available on the FDA website, fda.gov. From the foods desk, FDA recently issued warning letters to 3 food companies after inspections found serious violations in their facilities. I mention them not because I want to focus on these particular facilities, but because there have been concerns about the activity of the Human Foods Program. I recently heard Kyle Diamantes, the Deputy Commissioner for Foods, talk to the Alliance for a Stronger FDA about plans for the 2027 budget. We're now planning a podcast to discuss the 2027 budget request by FDA. We're going to stay on top of what's going on in the foods program. We've had a number of episodes on that, and it's good to see that FDA continues to have an active human foods program. I think Kyle Diamantes did a good job at the Alliance meeting in describing what FDA has been doing in that area and what they plan to do. And then finally, from the cosmetics desk, FDA released a recording of a recent Grand Rounds presentation featuring experts from the Office of Cosmetics and Colors at FDA on cosmetic product regulations under MOCRA. The session is really, really worth listening to. You can check that out on FDA's website. So now let's meet our guest. First up is an old friend, Mark DuVal. Mark is CEO of DuVal Associates. I've known Mark for several decades, back when he was with 3M and Medtronic. His law firm has been very successful. He does hibernate in Minneapolis, so we don't see him very often here in Washington. But his law firm deals with all aspects of FDA issues, not just medical devices, but also drugs and foods, even though today we're going to focus on devices. So, Mark, as always, it's good to see you, and we hope to have you back again because you're one of the leading voices in the medical devices area and have been for a long time.
Wayne, thanks for having us, my colleagues Bryan and Chris. And we're just grateful to be here. And yes, I am. I'm just waking up from hibernation here in Minneapolis, so I'm glad to be with you.
Well, your city's been in the news a lot lately. Unfortunately, not necessarily
Yes.
good news, but I think of you every time I see some news about Minneapolis. Bryan Feldhaus is president of DuVal Associates. His practice includes providing advice in areas of advertising and promotion, compliance, formal and informal appeals, 510K submissions. Before joining DuVal Associates, Bryan was a litigator. So welcome, Bryan Feldhaus, to FDA Watch.
Thank you, Wayne.
Let's welcome Chris Lyle. Chris is the first biostatistician that we've ever had on FDA Watch. He's vice president of evidence strategy at DuVal Associates. As I said, he's a biostatistician by training, over 25 years of experience in the medical devices industry. He successfully negotiated numerous study designs with FDA and also with regulatory agencies overseas. So welcome to FDA Watch, Chris.
Thanks so much.
The first question I'm going to ask of all of you, I'm going to start with Mark. Others can chime in. What's your take on what's happening right now at FDA as it relates to the medical devices industry, particularly what's happened over the last year, and how have things changed? How are things more challenging or less challenging for the industry? Mark, let me start with you on that.
Yeah, what a great and broad question. Let me start out with just saying from a personnel and process standpoint, Michelle Tarver, Dr. Tarver, who's the center director, has really been a breath of fresh air. She's really a great leader. She's a compassionate leader. She's very knowledgeable. And she just did a town hall here in Minneapolis with Medical Alley, and we had over 300 attendees, and she came with some of her colleagues as well. And they had a panel, and then they did breakout sessions. And this is emblematic. And the last town hall they did here was 15 years ago, and I actually organized it with Dr. Jeff Sharon, who's a former center director. But it was just a great town hall, and she's a great leader. And I think she takes the opportunity to really, really understand industry, and not just academically, but she'll dig in. We've had appeals with her, and she evidences a desire to see devices moving forward. If she finds a path forward, even if she doesn't overturn the review staff outright. But the other dynamic we have is that at the lower end of the spectrum, post Doge, and this has just generally been an issue with FDA. They've got a lot of young biomedical engineers and reviewers who see boogeymen in every closet and are incredibly risk averse, and yet they have a lot of decisional power placed in their laps. And so what they lack in experience really comes out in their reviews. And so sometimes it's getting very difficult to get files through the FDA. Everything becomes a scientific expedition without a destination, and they're getting very academic, and they're losing some of their moorings. So our job is to challenge that and to keep them in line. But generally speaking, great leadership, developing younger people, middle management's kind of where they were always at. We're optimistic about where the agency's headed under, at least at the Center for Devices under Dr. Tarver.
Yeah, I think Michelle has gotten very good reviews across the board. She's, I think, the only center director that served under the previous administration as well, and I think that's testament to her credibility and her leadership. And I want to ask one follow-up question before asking Bryan and Chris the same question, and that is, how are things really different now than they were, let's say, a year ago, last April and May, in terms of the way that you approach CDRH?
Well, we're very cautious with how we work. We've always been somewhat assertive with lower management when we present our files. And if we get involved in if our biomedical engineers are doing the submission, that's easy because we can put our imprint on it. But when the lawyers get it, sometimes it's by way of we've received an intractable train wreck from someone else. And even if they're good regulatory affairs professionals or very mediocre, they get stuck at FDA. So we're trying to help people insert ourselves earlier so we can affect the trajectory of a file going to the FDA. And so, because it's you really have to tell your story up front, early and often. And it's about communications. And Wayne, a lot of what I learned about communicating with the FDA, honestly, I learned from you early on in my career, and it really is all about communicating and getting those line people, those lower level review staff, respecting them, for the people that they are, but pushing them, and sometimes I feel like we're training them. Like a lot of appeals we used to take with Dr. Maisel, you'd have 27 people in the room and 10 or 15 online. I said, Bill, I'm a taxpayer. Why do we have so many people in here? And he said, Mark, honestly, it's a great opportunity for training when you guys do appeals. Because they don't know the law and the regulations and guidance as well as they should.
Bryan, same question. Overview, what's going on and how is it different?
Thanks, Wayne. I echo a lot of Mark's comments. The question was asked, over the last year, what has changed at the agency? I think it's probably best to look even a year before that, back to 2024, because that's really when the winds of change at the agency started to blow. It started with Dr. Maisel's retirement in March of 24, followed quickly by Dr. Shuren's retirement. Rusty Segan was named the OPEC director. There was the reorganization, and then Dr. Tarver was named as the CDRH director in October. And so, that year of change before everything that happened in 2025 under the new presidential administration, I think has really created 2 years of uncertainty at the agency. And as Mark mentioned, I think we're getting to a stage now under Dr. Tarver's leadership, where there's a lot more consistency, especially with upper level management. I think one of the takeaways, Mark mentioned it, the importance of telling your story. Whenever we talk with clients, or when we're in a formal meeting with the agency, such as a 517A appeal or something else, so often we hear the FDA say, "I wish we would have known this earlier. I wish this would have been." I wish there would have been more communication, or this would have been clarified earlier, because often it's the lack of communication or incomplete communication that results in challenges for device submissions. And so, that's kind of, I think, an overarching takeaway.
Wouldn't you say, Bryan, also that sometimes at our end, our clients' end, the CEOs of startup device companies, which fuels most of the innovation for the device side of the ledger, a lot of these CEOs are Pollyannish sometimes, and they're like, "Oh, I don't want to push FDA. I want just to kind of go along to get along. Let's work the process." And we're like, "No, you have to actually be rather forceful about where you're at times, and to keep the train on the track, because FDA and its reviewers will often get off track." And Chris knows this more than anybody when it comes to looking at the development of the science and the statistics applied to clinical trials, et cetera. If you don't have a meeting of the minds on that, the trial can be, you think you have an agreement on what the trial design is, and you were woefully wrong when it actually reports out and you submit it as part of your clearance, or you're granted de novo, or your PMA approval. So,
yeah, let me ask Chris the same question then. I asked Mark and Bryan, how do you view CDRH these days, and what's changed?
It's interesting. I don't have that much to add to what Mark and Bryan said, in part because I've only been here a couple of years, and before that I spent the last 10 years doing coverage work and reimbursement consulting. And so in terms of what's changed, I'm not sure. But it's and the work that I do here, it's heavily on appeals. So I sort of tend to move from issue to issue on these files that sort of fall into the interstices, into these gray areas between approval and non-approval. And so I just sort of move from issue to issue, and really don't get a chance to zoom out that much. So whatever Mark and Bryan said, I'm in agreement.
I'm going to interrupt him there, Wayne, and just add this. He's a brilliant biostatistician in the sense that when he gets into an FDA appeal, we have to deconstruct what the folks, the biostatistician, the FDA, are doing to destroy the file and prevent the clearance or the approval. So, Chris, we need somebody who can actually articulate these complex and somewhat arcane biostatistical issues into a more simple presentation for the appeal authority. And that's what Chris does best. We try and figure out where are they taking us, and where are they being architects of regulatory perfection in the way they're looking at the stats. Because we know a lot of devices might not meet their primary endpoint, yet they're still going to get a PMA approval or a de novo or whatever. And our job is to convince them why there's more to this set of data than they're looking at. There's more worth to this data than they're willing to attribute. So Chris does a remarkable job of that.
Let me shift gears, talk about pre-sub meetings. They're more important than ever. I want to start out with Bryan here. How should companies be thinking about how and whether to engage FDA early in the process? I know that the answer there is you engage them as early as possible, and Mark just addressed the issue of being fairly aggressive. But how do you approach a pre-sub meeting these days?
Well, as we mentioned before, I think the first thing to keep in mind is that it's your first opportunity to tell your story regarding your device and your future device submission. But that doesn't mean you simply jump into a pre-sub. I think you have to be really strategic. Given staffing concerns at the agency, it's taking longer to get feedback from the agency and have your pre-sub meetings. And so you have to be really strategic about what's the purpose of the meeting, what is it that you want to gain from the meeting. Is it necessary? That's one of the questions that we always ask, and I know Mark can elaborate on this point. Is a pre-sub required? Is it going to be beneficial? Is it going to help set the stage for future conversations? If the answers to those questions are no, you can probably skip the pre-sub and just move forward with your device submission.
Is that a good idea? I mean, I want to ask all three of you. Early communications is so important. The pre-sub is an opportunity to have those communications. So I'm just wondering when it would not be advantageous to have communication with FDA at that stage. Mark, would ask you that, and then ask Bryan and Chris to comment on that as well.
Sure. Well, and we just held 2 weeks ago, for Regulatory Affairs Professional Society, we had held a half-day webinar on to pre-sub or not to pre-sub. That's the question. So we addressed this in detail for the audience, that in the 510K, if you have a well-worn path and your device is not all that differentiable, there is no reason to go to FDA and start asking them a bunch of questions, because all you're going to do is get somebody pontificating in a deeper and broader level than you need or require. Now, on a de novo, where by nature you don't have a predicate, but yet it's still a moderate risk device, you probably are going to need a pre-sub because it's going to be associated with some data. And you never go to FDA saying, "Hey, what do you think we should do?" And they're not a consulting group anyway. You go to them saying, "Hey, here's what we're going to do. Now, give us some feedback on the following." And of course, you would with a PMA process. You're always going to be there's a lot of meetings that you're going to have leading up to a clinical trial design, starting with with pivotal, before the pivotal, their pilot, et cetera. So a lot of 510Ks, you have to be very circumspect about whether you're actually going to do a pre-sub. And the one thing you have to be careful of is pre-sub purgatory, is what we call it, where you get caught in this endless loop where FDA wants you to keep coming back and discussing things with them. And it's just an endless loop. Sometimes you just have to call a question.
Chris, any views on that, pre-subs?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just echo what's been said in the fact that you go in and you make the argument for what you want to do, and then take the time to explain why, right? Take the time to explain why you believe that this is adequate. If you believe that there are multiple aspects of your pending submission that are sort of asked and answered and straightforward, then just go ahead and leave those alone and make the pre-sub activities very targeted. But if you believe you have, and I'll just stick to sort of study design here, if you believe you have the right endpoint, you believe you have the right control, you believe you have the right time frame, and you compile those arguments in a thoughtful way, then you're very much advocating for that position. I think one of the things that, and I'll just say that I've really struggled with sometimes looking back on these communications, is that as the sponsors do make these recommendations, they do lay out what it is that they want to do, what's sort of come back is, well, you might want to consider, and this isn't the context of a pre-sub, but it might be in the context of an IDE approval, where you might get an additional consideration saying, you can go ahead with your study, but we aren't sold on your primary endpoint, or we aren't sold on your sample size, or we aren't sold on whatever it is. And that can end up just being really challenging, right? Because then you sort of find yourself, do I run this to ground, or do I push ahead? So I run hot and cold on pre-subs. They serve a purpose. They're often necessary. They're great to familiarize, especially if you're on the de novo pathway or the PMA pathway, to familiarize the review team with what it is that you have and what you're trying to do and the unmet need that it's trying to fill. But pick the elements that you're going to talk about, and be as scientific as you can about trying to persuade the FDA team to that position.
FDA, we hold FDA in an elevated status given the scientific evaluation they conduct every single day, but med device companies should also view themselves in a similar way. They know the technology, they know their indications, they know what their data is. Be presumptive about your position. And as Mark mentioned, instead of asking an open-ended question to the agency in a pre-sub, propose what it is you're going to do and why that's a scientifically appropriate position to take. It reminds me of when I was a trial attorney. You never wanted to ask the last question. You never wanted to ask on cross-examination one more question that could potentially derail your case. And the same applies to a pre-sub. You need to be presumptive, set the stage. If you need to get feedback, do it in a respectful and collaborative manner with the agency, but don't ask a question that you're not comfortable with getting the answer to, because it could derail your regulatory strategy. The other thing about pre-subs too, in a lot of the appeals that we handle, our clients will approach us and say, hey, we had a pre-sub in 2017 or 2018, so then we executed on the strategy based on the feedback we got from that pre-submission, and it's now 5-6 years later. Science changes quickly. It's changing very rapidly, especially with respect to software and AI. The feedback that you got several years ago may not be apt anymore, and it's really difficult to rely on that pre-sub feedback if it's outdated, which can create some challenges for your eventual submission too.
Yeah, that leads me to my next question. And as we move on beyond the pre-sub stage and into the submission and review stage, I'll ask Mark first. What are the most common breakdowns? Where does the system break down, or where is it really working very, very well? Is it, well, I'm not even going to speculate on it. I'll just let you answer. Where are the breakdowns, and what do you do about them?
Yeah, this is where I take us back to sort of the seminal beginning discussion of communication. I mean, it's really critical you communicate, but there's barriers to that. Sometimes you have inexperienced people in the industry not knowing what questions to ask, or and they're not very good. Biomedical engineers and scientific people generally, I learned this from you, Wayne, a long time ago. People often communicate in an upside down pyramid. They ramble, get to the point. And you always taught me, turn that pyramid around, get to the point, and then support it with an increasingly widening base of supportive information. Believe it or not, that's everybody we deal with in the scientific or biomedical engineering realm. They naturally, start out with the inverted pyramid, and they ramble, and they take a long time to get to the point. Our job is to teach. Sometimes we feel like we're more psychologists and communication professionals than regulatory lawyers, because we're just trying to get them to tell us, what is your device? What does it do? And what's the information that supports it? So a lot of that is just simply communications. At the FDA's end, it's a lot of people who don't have enough time to really adequately review the information, or they're not very organized people because they're young in their careers and they just don't get it done properly. So you can't assume that when you walk in the door, they know what you're doing. So whatever document we're submitting, whether it be a pre-sub or a appeal or anything before that, we always think of an executive summary, something that tells them right up front what this device is, what it does, and what our regulatory argument is, and what our data does to support our position. Because sometimes the the only thing that, the other person, the middle manager coming in with the reviewer is going to read is the executive summary walking in that meeting. And we want to be persuasive about our position. And the last thing I would say is if you feel like your reviewer isn't getting it done, you can ask for adult supervision earlier rather than later to help shepherd the process. And we often do that. You've got to do it respectfully and whatnot, but you know when you're going a little bit askance. You're going not on the track any longer.
So Bryan, same question. Where are the breakdowns? What do you do about them?
Yeah, I echo all of Mark's points. We've harped on communication. That's critical. I think the other challenge and why there's often a breakdown is industry approaches a submission with an expectation that they're going to go down pathway A. And they're basing that information on, prior device clearances, de novos, things of that nature that's publicly available. And the reality is FDA has a lot more information that's not necessarily included in a 510K clearance or a de novo grant. And so sometimes the industry or the sponsor is working at an information deficit as compared to what FDA has. And that deficit leads to communication breakdowns, improper expectations, all of which can be resolved through adequate communication and the adult supervision strategy that Mark referenced. But I do think that is often, that information deficit is often a precursor to, an adverse event during the course of a submission.
Can I add one thing to that, Wayne?
Sure.
It's a lot of the reviewers we talk about operating within the framework. FDA folks are operating within, they have to know the regulations, the guidance, or the statute, the regulations and the guidance, and they have to color within the lines or the box that they're put into. For a substantial equivalence determination, it's a comparative standard. For a de novo and for a PMA, it's reasonable assurance and safety and effectiveness. In an absolute and independent sense, and you have to show that the probable benefit outweighs the probable risk. And so when we communicate with them, we often put things on a scale. Did we actually tip the scale at the benefit over the risk? But the biomedical reviewers and the chemists and the people who are down below who are on the review staff, even the chief medical officer, they do not at all operate within the box. They don't color within the lines. They're just thinking, hey, I'm waving the banner of patient safety, and I'm going to personally decide, what it is to ensure that this product is safe and effective before it gets on the market. And sometimes you get the most innocuously simple, safe products that we can't get through because they overthink it. And then by the time you get to upper management, they overturn them because it's ridiculously conservative and risk averse.
Especially among some of the subject matter experts at the agency. They're so focused on a particular subject matter, such as biocompatibility, that you lose sight of the patient, the innovation and the patient benefit to be derived from the device as a whole.
On that note, I'm going to take a quick break here. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. And we're back. We're talking about medical devices. Mark DuVal, Bryan Feldhaus, Chris Lyle of DuVal Associates from Minneapolis. I want to start out, Chris, with a question about evidence. There seems to be an evolution at CDRH and generally at FDA about what constitutes evidence, endpoints, the durability, even real world evidence, which FDA continues to evolve its definition of. From your, what is your perspective on what's going on with regard? I'm going to make this a very general question. What does evidence in terms of a medical device look like, and where are companies getting tripped up in terms of providing the evidence for a 510K or for a PMA or for anything in between that FDA wants?
Yeah, great question. If I think about this, if I put on my statistics hat for just a second, if you'll all permit me, I don't think that the nature of evidence or the burden of evidence has necessarily changed. whereas the purpose of a clinical study has always been to say, when I'm finished with this, it should be clear whether or not these data justify a clearance or an approval or a de novo grant. In theory, you work with FDA to define the parameters of that experiment. You decide what good looks like, you decide what success looks like, and you move forward. And if you happen to pass on all counts, that's great, because now you should have something that is straightforward and easy to move forward with. But trials are random, right? And you do them one time, and things can happen, and safety signals can emerge, or missing data can become a problem, or sometimes primary endpoints get missed. And then you find yourself in the world now of going back and forth and having clinical conversations about what it all means. I would say over the last couple of decades, I seem to see now a greater emphasis on sort of the rigorous statistical definition that comes part and parcel with all of this, i.e., if you design a study and you miss an endpoint, you're kind of done, but you're done statistically, right? Because classical statistics says if you miss your primary endpoint, you can't garner inference anywhere else. You can't go and make inference anywhere else. And statistically, that's true, but stats is only a part of the story. And so now you enter a world of clinical significance. And so you have to now be in this world of, how do we talk about what we've learned? How do we talk rationally about what it is that we've shown? We define the game. Perhaps one came up short, but is there still enough here? And so whereas 20 years ago, I felt that there might have been more flexibility. If you happen to come up short, or there might have been more of an appetite for doing non-hypothesis testing based clinical studies, or just characterizing adverse events, or just getting granular point estimates and all of that. I see a little bit less of an appetite for that now. I see a bit more rigor wanted in the design. But also, it does worry me in the cases when, say, something does come up short. We need to be able to pivot now and have the conversation about, what do we see in front of us? Is there still a path forward to approval based on what we just learned?
And talk a little bit about real world evidence. FDA has been grappling with that for some time in the drug area and the devices area. How do you see that playing into an application these days? And how do you develop real world evidence that will meet your statistical needs?
Yeah, and I think the stats side of it, theoretically gets pretty easy, because if you can get access to 300,000 records in an insurance database, sample size isn't going to be a problem. But I think about real world evidence the same way that I think about designing a study up front. Are these data that we are now pulling in, are they representative of what it is that we would have hoped to enroll in the first place? Is this the logical basis from which to support an approval? At the town hall last week that Mark mentioned, one of the FDA members of senior leadership who was there said, not all real world data is real world evidence. And there's a lot to that, right? Just because if you just happen to find a data set and it happens to support your position, that's probably not going to be enough. We have to talk about why these data support the position. Can you make logical comparisons against whether it be historical controls or against other active treatments that make sense and allow you to draw a rational conclusion that you actually perform the way that you think you do, or that you hope you do? So it's still the basis for the data. Are they complete? Are they understood? Are they from patients that represent the basis of the population that you intend to treat? So and I would say the real world evidence guidance speaks to that. The same checklist that you go through when designing a study and saying this should support an approval is the exact same checklist you go through on the backside saying, why should these data support approval? Because they want to know that it's an appropriate basis.
And I would add, importantly, Chris, it's fun to have Chris on board because he works with this all the time. But when we're looking at real world evidence, so what their agency first and foremost is looking at, are you introducing bias by the way you're collecting the data? So they want you to fashion a prospective design to go back to get this retrospective review of data that already exists. And so if they can be convinced that you're not cherry picking things or biasing things, skewing them in any way, fashion, or form, they're probably going to be okay with it. I would suffice to say RWE, or real world evidence, isn't as broad as we were thinking it would be when they first initiated it. I was thinking, oh wow, there's going to be a lot of. I've got some data from England and Spain or whatever in Europe, and this is going to be pretty good, and we just throw it at the agency. No, it has to be a little more rigorous than that.
Mark, I want to just ask one more question or two more questions before we conclude here. You mentioned before what happens when FDA changes its mind. We see that all, I'm not going to say frequently, but we see that where you begin on a clinical program, you complete it, you go into the FDA, and they say, well, that was good 3 years ago when you showed it to us the first time, but things have changed. How do you make sure, it's a question for you, Mark, and then I'll ask Bryan and Chris briefly to answer. How do you try to avoid that kind of reaction on the part of FDA? And what do you do when you do get that reaction?
Yeah, this is a real issue with the agency. So in the pre-submission process, one of the benefits of the process is that you get to take meeting minutes, and there can even be meeting minutes disagreements, and you can go back and forth and say, hey, here's what was actually said in the meeting. And sometimes FDA, frankly, will make things up later on that were not said, and then you lock in on that, and you're supposed to be able to rely on that for the long term. And Dr. Shern, one of the things he really tried to put upon the review staff is, look, if we're coming out with a new guidance, for example, and it comes up with a standard, and you're in the middle of a clinical trial, and you've detrimentally relied on our input, and you're going through that trial, and that guidance isn't earth shaking, that you have to do things like this going forward, or the data that you provide is not any good. It's usually a situation where they're looking for the optimal data set that they can get. So guidance documents coming in midstream are problematic, and the review staff can rely on them. And we always go back to management and say, hey, we really should be held to what we agreed to. And then meeting minutes are very, very important. And we do try and get them recorded with great fidelity, because those are often the basis for our appeal if the agency is trying to later renege from them. And frankly, they do quite often. Bryan, you probably want to add something to this.
Thanks, Mark. There's a concept in the law called estoppel. And I won't go into the elements of estoppel, but when it comes to a situation like this, that's what I think of. The doctrine of estoppel basically means if somebody relies on something or representation by a party, they should be able to move forward in reliance on that representation for future conduct. And the same applies here. That's why, as Mark mentioned, it's really important to build it into the record, whether through meeting minutes, even email communications, just some contemporaneous writing to confirm what was agreed upon. And that is why there's a value in pre-subs. But this is it's a challenge. Things change quickly. We are in a period of change, especially for digital devices. They're changing so rapidly. It's tough to keep up, and FDA's position can change rapidly as well.
There's a hierarchy of evidence too. I was going to mention to what Bryan said, because when he said a lot of times we still try, and if we don't have if we're not in a meeting that requires meeting or allows for meeting minutes, and then this exchange and the finalization and putting them on the record, that's great. But when we don't have that, as Bryan said, sometimes we're trying to memorialize it in an email. But as it relates to the hierarchy of evidence, that's not as persuasive to the appeal authority, because it's a unilateral document. We've created it. Hopefully, we've induced a response by FDA that, yeah, we agree with you, but very likely we have not. So it just exists there as a unilateral document we've created. But it's better than nothing. But the meeting minutes that we agree upon are the best in the hierarchy.
This is the final question. There are times when you escalate. When do you escalate? Mark?
Yeah, well, we have a whole presentation we give on this. We have a 2-day 510K program, again, for reps, where one of the sessions I have is on this subject. But There are a lot of informal ways as you're working your way up to try and escalate, and that just means, hey, getting, like we said, adult supervision involved. That means mid to upper level management involved earlier rather than later. There's an LB flag, or least burdensome flag process they've instituted. When you get an AIN letter and you think, hey, this thing's it's going off trajectory early on, and upper management created it, and they invited us as an industry to come to them earlier rather than later before the problem. He described it as a meteor that's going to enter the gravitational pull of the Earth and hit the Earth, and things are never retrievable from that point. It's if you let us know earlier, before it gets in the atmosphere of the Earth, we can knock it off its trajectory, and hopefully we can attend to some of these issues that might be an appeal issue later on. But absent those two sort of more informal ways, then we look at 517A of the statute, where we appeal a significant decision, definitionally speaking. So, and then we always have 21 CFR 10.75 to do an appeal, but that has no timeline. The statute, 517A, has a 30-day to file your appeal, 30 days to have it heard orally or in writing, and then 30 days for the FDA to make its decision. So it's a 90-day total process. It's super efficient, and we do a lot of them. We've done over, I think we're getting close to 450 of these between LB flags and appeals over the years. So it's a very efficient process, 517A. We really like it.
Okay. On that note, let me turn to our resource link segment. If you subscribe on FDAWatch.net, which I encourage everybody to do, you have links to certain stories and other information. All you've got to do is click on that. On the Pharma resource link in mid-April, Endpoint News reported that Rick Pazner, who's the former chief of oncology, warned about the political influence over FDA. We're watching what Rick is saying, because obviously he was an extremely important person at the agency, head of the Oncology Center of Excellence for many years. I think is now consulting. He commented that the changes at FDA could affect the consistency and the integrity of regulatory decision making. The story on Endpoint News, which quoted Rick, is available on our resource link. In the medical devices area, FDA issued a draft guidance outlining a compliance policy for certain NIOSH-approved air purifying respirators. The policy clarifies how FDA intends to apply, or in some cases exercise, enforcement discretion over pre-market and other regulatory requirements for these products, especially when they're already approved by NIOSH, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. So again, if you go to our resource page, you can access that draft guidance. In the foods area, FDA and nonprofit Stop Foodborne Illness have been jointly hosting a food safety culture series. The next one, which is called Food Safety Culture Debate Club, is on May 14th. And if you go to our resource link, you can access more information, not only about that upcoming one, but also about previous installments in their series. And then finally, in the cosmetics area, Garg Law, the law firm of Shelley Garg, who used to work with me in co-hosting FDA Watch, recently did a breakdown of FDA's PFAS in cosmetics reports. The analysis highlights significant data gaps and uncertainty around PFAS safety in cosmetics, emphasizing the need for further research. Our link takes you to Shelley's insightful article. Again, all of these links are available at FDA Watch. So let me conclude by thanking Mark and Bryan and Chris. This has been a really good session and very, very understandable in terms of how to approach FDA and what's going on at CDRH. We need to continue to have that dialogue, because I think the more that we talk about what's going on at CDRH, the easier it will be for companies to deal with the center and to get some really useful new devices, especially in the digital health area. I think Mark mentioned that before. I want to thank our podcast creator and executive producer, Michael Levin Epstein, our assistant producer, Sam Hoffmeister. I want to remind you, if you want to be a guest on the show, want to be a marketing partner, want to be a sponsor, or just comment, we do have a way of communicating, info@fdawatch.net, and definitely check out our general website, fdawatch.net. I know I've mentioned that a number of times. Finally, if you want to give us a 5-star rating, we would love it. Go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. It really does make a difference. So let me conclude this session by signing off as usual. As we say at the end of every episode of FDA Watch, if you really want to watch what FDA is doing, listen to FDA Watch. This is Wayne Pines signing off again.